Gordon Brown enters Downing Street as Britain's new Prime Minister.
On this day, I remember words that have stayed with me since my childhood. My school motto, I will try my utmost. This is my promise to all of the people of Britain. And now let the work of change begin. Thank you.
Gordon Brown became Prime Minister on the 27th of June 2007 after Tony Blair stepped down. His tenure as Prime Minister would be just less than 3 years, and it is dominated by the financial crisis, an event that began with a subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, but which was to have a global impact, bringing about the largest recession in the UK since the recessions of the 1920s and 1930s. At the time, he came across as a Prime Minister who had ran out of ideas. After all, he had been the UK's longest serving Chancellor and so had dominated the domestic agenda during Blair's time in power. But this assessment might be unfair. In the early months of his premiership, he confronted an immediate series of crises, and he dithered and then decided against calling an early election as his poll ratings increased. But it was his handling of the financial crisis that was to define his leadership. His experience as Chancellor meant that he guided the UK through this crisis effectively, and he was credited with providing global leadership that helped to persuade world leaders to get behind a massive stimulus package to keep the economy going. But then Leader of the Opposition, David Cameron, used the financial crisis to argue that the economic consequences of the crisis were the fault of the Labour Party's mismanagement of the economy. It was a false charge, but it stuck, and Labour would go on to lose the 2010 election, falling to a vote share of just 29% in that election, their worst result measured in percentage of the vote since 1918.
The next 48 hours will be crucial as he makes the biggest decision of his political life. Polls suggest Brown's never been this popular, but can he bank on it to last?
Within months of taking over as leader, Labour established a strong lead over the Conservatives, which led to fevered media speculation that Brown might call an early election. This reached fever pitch during the Labour Party's conference in late September, as several polls came out showing Labour over 10 points ahead. After dithering over the decision, Brown decided against an early election as evidence started to come in that the polls were narrowing, but many have subsequently argued that this was a mistake. The timing of general elections is one of the key powers of the Prime Minister, and in hindsight, an autumn election probably would have been a good idea. But there is no guarantee that Labour would have won this election. One need only look at the early election Theresa May called in 2017 to appreciate that a strong poll lead can quickly dissipate during the campaign, especially given Labour had been in power for a decade by this point, and Brown, as Chancellor during Blair's time in power, would find it difficult to dissociate himself from that period in order to present himself as someone with a fresh agenda for the country. Still, with hindsight, given that the polls would never be as rosy for Labour after this point, failing to call an early election was probably a mistake.
Chris, good morning to you. As the Wall Street Journal is saying this morning, the American financial system has been, and I'm quoting here, shaken to its core.
Financial institutions are in trouble. 158-year-old Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy.
Financial markets around the world went into free fall today as confidence in the banking system fell sharply.
The roots of the financial crisis of 2008 lay, ultimately, in the neoliberal economic consensus that had gained traction in the United States and the UK since the Thatcherite and Reaganite revolutions of the 1980s. The logic of this neoliberal position is that the private sector and the market always deliver better outcomes than regulation or the state. When applied to the financial system, this meant deregulation and a lack of oversight into what was going on in banks, which was to lead to a crisis in 2008 that was to threaten to bring down the banking system and perhaps even capitalism along with it. The specific problem in 2008 was with the mortgage market in the United States, where mortgage brokers were incentivized to sell mortgages to people with poor credit ratings during a time where house prices were rising fast. These loans were then sold off and repackaged into financial instruments called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, which were then given a AAA rating, the highest rating possible, by ratings agencies, and offered a higher return to investors than government bonds. What the banks didn't realise is that a lot of the debt packaged into these financial instruments was bad debt, which would quickly be revealed when the housing market bubble burst in the United States and those who had taken out the debts in the first place started defaulting, bringing the whole house of cards down with it and leaving banks across the world holding on to hundreds of billions of pounds worth of assets that had lost much of their value overnight.
Good morning. Up and down the country, families and small businesses are worried and anxious about their futures. And I know and understand this. This is not a time for conventional thinking or outdated dogma, but for the fresh and innovative intervention that gets to the heart of the problem.
£400 billion is being made available to help Britain's biggest banks through these extraordinary times.
First, the government will part nationalise banks that need help to stay afloat. The cost, up to £50 billion of taxpayers' money. We'll all become, in effect, shareholders in them, shares the government hopes one day to sell for a profit.
At the height of the crisis, the UK government spent £136 billion bailing out the banking system in the UK. But after factoring in money recouped since the crisis, the Office of Budget Responsibility has calculated a net loss to the Treasury of £33 billion as a result of the bank bailouts. Now, this seems a small price to pay for avoiding what might have been an even deeper recession. And Gordon Brown should also be credited with his work with global leaders, where a London summit of the G20 agreed a $1.1 trillion rescue package for the global economy, an agreement that almost certainly moderated the length and depth of the global recession.
The first point of recapitalisation was to save banks that would otherwise have collapsed. And we not only saved the world, saved the banks and saved the banks and led the way. We not only saved the bank.
The problem for Brown's government was that the financial crisis had dramatically worsened the public finances, with the national debt doubling from 40% to 80% of GDP, and with the budget deficit increasing to over 12% of GDP, which meant that the government was spending far more than it received in taxation. This was leapt upon by David Cameron, leader of the opposition, who argued that the UK's financial situation was a product of Brown's poor handling of the economy, a charge which was false and unfair, but which gained traction and sullied the Labour Party's economic reputation.
The Queen has kindly agreed to the dissolution of Parliament, and a general election will take place on May the 6th. Britain is on the road to recovery, and nothing we do should put that recovery at risk.
Labour went into the 2010 election campaign behind in the polls and facing a newly revitalised Conservative Party under the fresh, youthful leadership of David Cameron, who had sought to modernise and rebrand the Conservative Party by moving the party to the left on social and environmental issues, and by suggesting that his government would empower individuals by creating a big society. Labour's message during the election was clear that the country was on the right track and couldn't risk electing a Conservative government.
There are real signs that we're on the right road. And I really don't think now is a time to change direction. To cut and run. No. All around the world, economists are saying see this through. The Conservatives say they know better. They want to take us on a different path. Things are still fragile, which is why now is not the time to change teams and go off in a different direction.
Labour's message in 2010 was oddly reminiscent of most Conservative campaigns, as they warned of the dangers of electing a new and inexperienced government. But this message simply wasn't going to work in the circumstances, as many people blamed Labour for the economic situation and felt that it was time for change.
Now, in a moment, as Big Ben strikes 10, we'll be able to give the result of our exit poll. For the first time, not an opinion poll, not people saying how they intend to vote, but people answering the question after they've voted. How did you vote? And that's how this is formed. We went to 130 different polling places to find this out. But remember, this is only an exit poll. If it was dead accurate, there'd be no need for anybody to go and vote. 10 o'clock. And this is what we're saying. It's going to be a hung parliament with the Conservatives as the largest party.
The result of the 2010 election was defeat and the first hung parliament in the UK following an election since February 1974. This produced a coalition between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats that would govern for a full 5 years and would be the beginning of 14 years of Conservative-led government. It's often said that all political careers end in failure, and this was the case with Gordon Brown. But how are we to assess his premiership overall? In a way, it seems unfair to focus so narrowly on his time as Prime Minister because of his centrality as Chancellor of the Exchequer in domestic policy during Blair's time in power, which makes an argument for him getting more credit because his fingerprints are all over the Labour Party's domestic legacy over the whole 13 years they were in government. Here, for example, is Gordon Brown defending this record.
If anyone says that to fight doesn't get you anywhere, that politics can't make a difference, that all parties are the same, then look at what we have achieved together since 1997. The winter fuel allowance, the shortest waiting times in history, crime down by a third, the creation of Sure Start, the cancer guarantee, record results in schools, more students than ever, the Disability Discrimination Act, devolution, civil partnerships, peace in Northern Ireland, the social chapter, 500,000 children out of poverty, maternity pay, paternity leave, child benefit at record levels, the minimum wage, the ban on cluster bombs, the cancelling of debt, the trebling of aid, the first ever Climate Change Act. That's the Britain we've been building together. That's the change we choose.
Taken as a whole then, Gordon Brown can be credited with a strong domestic record, including landmark legislative changes whilst he was Prime Minister, such as the Equality Act. And his handling of the financial crisis adds weight to the strength of this leadership. Yet it's also the case that he led the Labour Party to a pretty catastrophic defeat, partly due to lacking the ability that his immediate predecessor Tony Blair had in being able to make a case to the public. My own view is that Gordon Brown was largely unlucky to inherit the crown when he did, at a moment when his government would inevitably be thrown into crisis followed by defeat. And yet this is the nature of the top job, and so Brown must ultimately rank as a fairly mediocre and unsuccessful Prime Minister, albeit one who looks rather better in light of what was to follow.
I have always strived to serve, to do my best in the interests of Britain, its values and its people. And as I leave the second most important job I could ever hold, I cherish even more the first, as a husband and father. Thank you, and goodbye.
That's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed the video, which is part of a series of videos on post-war Prime Ministers. If you liked this one, please like, share and subscribe, and maybe think about watching the rest of the series. Best wishes, and goodbye for now.